China's Communist Party has always viewed stability as their most important thing. Wouldn't it be why hasn't the U.S. government come up with a policy that if China's unemployment rate went up 1 to 3%, 1% of 1.4 billion people is very hard for their system to take, and is a challenge to the communist government. 2%, it's a lot for them. Why hasn't there been any way, like such as now what's happening with the tariffs? Why haven't leaders done a policy to try to force the Chinese regime to change, or to end the Chinese regime? Because it could be done, because we have the leverage.
Yeah, so I mean, I talk about it in the book. It's about diplomacy, and there's actually a small book in addition to mine that called it's written by James Mann. It's called The China Fantasy, and he talks about two things: a soothing scenario and the I don't know the implosion scenario. The soothing scenario is China's going to be a democracy. Don't need to worry.
Mm-hmm.
And in the implosion scenario is it's on the brink of disaster. You don't want to push it because you don't want to create chaos.
Mm-hmm.
Now both those talking points come from the Chinese Communist Party themselves, but we bought into them. Our diplomats bought into them. Our China experts bought into them, and so that's what we tell ourselves. Well, we can't possibly force Chinese companies to abide by the Securities and Exchange Commission and PCAOB auditing and transparency requirements, because that would cause, just like you said, their economy to decline, and then they would have problems because they're such a fragile country. The answer is they have taken the idea of emerging market country to a new level of coming to the United States and really any international institution and saying, hey, you need to treat us differently because we're an emerging market economy. And then basically you open the door that wide and they run through a mile. So this is why we allow them to sell their stocks on our stock exchange without actually auditing their companies. This is why we allow them to have essentially tariff and non-tariff barriers to their companies, to our companies, but none to theirs. This is why we basically subsidize their postage, so our businesses couldn't compete, because it's cheaper to mail a product from Beijing to Washington D.C. than it is from D.C. to D.C. All of these things are things that we did on the basis of, as I said, enabling China.
But we have time after time again to correct this, but the politicians don't do anything. Is it because that their portfolios, they're globalist?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, they make whether it's corporate America, higher margins,
right?
as I talked about, whether it's Wall Street, which is basically getting a fee for each one of those either equities or debt instruments that are sold. Same thing, right? They're happy,
But how about on the military side? I've heard stories that a recent Chinese plane, basically, when Boeing or one of the main companies looked at it, American companies, they said, this is similar to one of our top secret designs that we're building for the Air Force, and it turned out it was stolen through cyber attacks. What is your feeling, just all the IP, not only military, but across the board, what's happening at universities, at companies from Microsoft to Google to all across the board?
Well, I mean, I think it amounts to 300 to 600 billion dollars a year, year
That's
over
being
year.
stolen.
So that's being stolen, and that's been consistent. But you mentioned something military. One of the things that they've done is something that we did to the Soviets. So Eisenhower he ran a project called Project Solarium, and he had 3 different teams that kind of brought solutions to him, and that's where they came up with the idea for containment and mutually assured destruction. They realized that we would bankrupt America trying to face Russia in the folded gap in Europe with all their conventional arms. So we said, we're not going to do that. We're going to focus on deterrence. We're going to build a strong nuclear force that will prevent the Soviets from wanting to attack the United States. and then we're going to focus on our economy. Eisenhower National Highway System. We're going to focus on R&D. R&D was 2%. We're going to send our students to STEM education. We're going to invest in our people. And we're going to invest in our country. We're going to become an economic and science and technology superpower. That's exactly what the Chinese have done.
They're doing the Eisenhower plan.
And then we basically did the opposite. And so, the idea that now you look at the military balance in the Pacific, and what I say in the book is, look, in 2015, this is before McMaster was a national security advisor. He was in Army Forces Command, in Army Futures Command. And me and one of my fellow, one of the guys that worked for me in the China shop, we went to him and we said, look, we have to come out of this INF treaty. It's killing us. They spend $1 defending their dominion in the first island chain for every $30 we spend to project power, and that's because they can build ballistic missiles that are very cheap, very effective, very good deterrent, and we can't build any. And so that campaign took 3 years. The president just recently in August pulled out of that to allow the United States to actually be able to create the kind of weapons that allow us on an economic basis to be economically efficient in how we put out our forces. So we spend $800 billion on the defense this year, or every year. And it doesn't give us the same level of national security that we had, say, in the Reagan years, because there was a strategy to how we were buying things. Today we're just buying things.
How do we beat China at its own game?
Very easy. Number one, we focus on principles. We align free trade with democratic principles. Those two have to go together. And what that means is when we open ourselves as a nation, when you have full access to trade, finance, investment, the internet with the United States, then you ought to share the principles, democratic principles, human rights, civil liberties, rule of law. If you don't, then you're going to have a lot less access. When you do that, you can begin to protect all of our institutions. You begin to look at the world differently. That's what's going on now. Our departments and agencies in the federal bureaucracy are beginning to change. They're beginning to look at the Chinese Communist Party and its influence on all aspects of society and defend.
But saying that, just even you're talking about human rights. Right now, China has over 1 million Muslims in camps.
Right.
United States doesn't say a thing. Rest of the world doesn't say a thing. How is the U.S.? You say the U.S. is changing. How is it changing?
So if you go back to 2 years ago and look at how many times the State Department called out China for just that kind of behavior, or putting people on ECMO machines and then harvesting their organs and then burning, incinerating the bodies, that didn't happen. It's happening now. The State Department actually is beginning to call out China. It's the first time that we've done it in the last 4 administrations, actually 5 administrations.
When you say the harvesting, how are they doing it? Is it just criminals? What are they doing?
Oh no, it's prisoners of conscience.
It's prisoners of conscience.
I highly encourage you to read the UK Tribunal. Just came out. The summary report just came out, and it will horrify you. It really will.
How many people a year are they?
They estimate somewhere between 60 and 90,000 people are killed a year. These are prisoners of conscience. These are people that are either Falun Gong or Christians or Muslims that are rounded up. And what they do is they blood type you, and then they give you an ultrasound of your organs when you're interned as a prisoner. And then if you have,
sounds like some out of a science fiction movie, a horror movie.
Then if you happen to have a match, then they hook you up to an ECMO machine. An ECMO machine really is a machine to keep your organs alive if the brain is dead. And so they hook them up to the ECMO machines, and they just basically proceed to harvest organs. But I mean, so to go back, the part that we haven't done that we really need to do is to begin to invest in our country. Just like I said, invest in our industrial base, invest in our infrastructure, STEM education, research and development. All this, by the way, is in the national security strategy. But we have to have the will to implement it. I'm telling you, 2 or 3 more carrier battle groups is not going to protect this country, but putting our own students in those STEM education positions rather than Chinese students, which we have 152,000 in the country right now. You know, my son just graduated from in computer science 2 years ago.
Mhm.
He was the only one American in his class. All the rest were Chinese.
Mm.